I want to thank everyone for coming out here tonight. My name is Ryan Mears. I am the Chief Trial Deputy at the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Annual Community Justice Academy. One of the things that we talk about at the Prosecutor's Office is really our two main objectives in fulfilling the criminal justice system, and that is both the engagement component and the enforcement component. I think a lot of people understand the enforcement aspect of what we do. Sometimes we have to send people to jail for long periods of time when they break the law. But equally as important to us is the engagement portion of what we do, the engagement aspect of reaching out to the community and make sure that we are listening to the community that we serve. Prosecutor Terry Curry and his staff have literally gone to hundreds of community meetings over the course of the last year. And one of the most important things that we can do at those meetings is listen. Listen to the concerns of the community, listen to what's going on in your neighborhoods. What are some of the issues that you'd like to see get a little bit more attention? What are some of the issues that maybe you'd like to learn a little bit more as it relates to the community or to the criminal justice system? And hopefully, the Community Justice Academy is a reflection of those conversations that we have had over the course of the last year. So this is a 4-night event. We encourage everyone to attend all 4 nights. I see some familiar faces here. How many people have been here more than once, just by show of hands? Pretty good turnout. Anybody been here 3 out of the 7 years? There we go. 5 out of 7? Anyone got 5 out of 7? There we go.
We got the shirts to prove it.
And what about 7 out of 7? There we go. I like giving up for the people who've been here 7 out of 7 years. We appreciate your enthusiasm for the program, and for those of you who are first-timers who are new to this, if you go to all 4 sessions, not only do you get to learn a lot, but you also get a commemorative t-shirt indicating your graduation and completion of the Community Justice Academy. So we look forward to you guys.
Ryan, pass down the model there.
Yeah, there we go. We got a good model there in the back. So you get a shirt similar to that if you're able to complete the program. This program is meant to be educational, but it's not school. So if you need to get up to use the restroom, there are restrooms in the back. If you need to get refreshments, please feel free to get refreshments. I would also let you know that we are being taped right now. This is going to air on the government channel. We want to thank them for coming out here and taping this for us today. And so you'll get an opportunity to maybe see yourself on TV and watch this when it re-airs. One of the reasons that I love working at the Marion County Prosecutor's Office is because we have a great team. And some of the people who make up that team are here today. And I just wanted to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge them and their efforts in putting on the Community Justice Academy. One of the people that we have here today is our communications director. If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Peg McLeish. Thanks for being here.
Peg is here. We also have Nikina Crane. Nikina, if you'd stand up and let us know who you are.
Hi, Nikina Crane, Deputy Prosecutor.
We also have with us Michelle Waymeyer. Michelle.
Michelle Waymeyer, Supervisor of Community Prosecution.
Benita.
Benita Farrell, second prime child abuse paralegal.
And she's also served as an advocate for us, which she's going to tell you a little bit about her experience, and the incomparable Annie Kern. Yeah.
Outreach Coordinator for the Marion County Prosecutor's Office.
He's standing by the food because that's what he does best, Michael Leffler. We are also fortunate to have some of our law enforcement partners here with us. We have Major Craig McCart.
Craig McCart, IMPD Major Investigation.
And we are also fortunate to have with us Detective Kern.
North District Investigation.
And we appreciate them coming out here as well. We have a great team, but no team is complete without its captain, and we are fortunate here in Marion County to have great leadership from our elected prosecutor. There are 400 people who work in the Marion County Prosecutor's Office each and every single day. 180 of those individuals are deputy prosecutors. We resolve 40,000 cases a year, and when we resolve those 40,000 cases a year, we take the cue from our leader, from our captain, Mr. Terry Curry. Mr. Curry asked us to do one thing when we resolve those cases, and that's to do the right thing. If you're dealing with a low-level offender or someone who maybe has a drug issue, maybe doing the right thing is directing that person to services so they can get the help that they need. If you're dealing with individuals who are first-time offenders, maybe you cut them a break so they can move on with their life, maybe learn from the experience, but not have something hold them back as they try to move forward, get a job, and go to school. And if doing the right thing sometimes means that if you're dealing with a very violent offender, you need to send that person to jail for a very long time. Terry Curry graduated from Butler University, where he played both basketball and golf. I can assure you he still is quite the golfer, and he's always open to being challenged, so if anybody wants to take him on later, let him know. But he has been a prosecutor here for the last 2 terms. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the captain of the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, Mr. Terry Curry.
Thank you, Ryan. Indeed, welcome to the 7th Annual Annie Kern Public Safety Smorgasbord. As I've said, I think virtually every year, in our first year in office in 2011, Annie approached me about, hey, I got this great idea to do programs every Monday night during the month of October. And as I have in the past, I thought it was kind of a goofy idea. And as it turned out, Annie was right and I was dead wrong looking around this room. And so each year we look to do something different. And one of the things that we've talked about, in not only in preparing for this year's CJA, but also after the Richmond Hill cases, is to do something to give the public a little more understanding about what all is involved in getting a case investigated and getting a case prosecuted. For most of the public, when a crime occurs, particularly about the Richmond Hill or the murder of DJ Keys that we're going to be talking about tonight, most of the public might see a story on the press when the crime occurred. They'll see something when an arrest is made, and then they'll see something about the resolution, whether the person was convicted or perhaps found not guilty. But to get from that point A to that final point, in this case from the point that a crime occurred until the completion of the case, there is just an enormous amount of work that is involved. And so what we've tried to do here tonight with this is to give all of you a better idea of everything that's involved in investigating a crime, putting a case together, and then prosecuting those cases. In the case of the Richmond Hill case, what we wanted the public to understand was the enormity of what occurred, the incredible investigation that was necessary in order to identify the individuals who had committed the crime, and then just the logistical nightmare of trying those cases in South Bend and Fort Wayne. And so I did want to make a pitch as well that if any of your neighborhood associations, church groups would be interested in having us come and present the PowerPoint regarding the Richmond Hill case, we're happy to do that. You can see Annie or Peg, and we're happy to come present that. But tonight, we're going to be talking about the murder of Thomas Keys, who is also known as DJ Keys. And the investigation, and we'll start with the investigation by Detective Schemenauer. We're going to have Vanita Farrow talk a little bit about her role as a victim advocate. And then next week, we will have the deputy prosecutor who tried the cases tell you about putting together the trial and prosecuting those cases. As you will hear, ultimately 6 individuals were convicted for the murder of DJ Keys. And like a lot of the cases, you will hear that the investigation is a combination of, number one, utilizing the sophisticated forensic and technology that we have available today, and a lot of it is just plain old shoe leather. And it was a phenomenal investigation and ultimately a successful prosecution of the case. So the first speaker tonight will be Detective Brian Schemenauer. Detective Schemenauer began his law enforcement career in April 1997 as a deputy sheriff for the Marion County Sheriff's Department. He became patrolman for the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department during the 2007 Marion County Sheriff's Department IPD merger. In August 2008, Brian transferred to the Criminal Investigations Branch, where he specialized as a robbery detective. In March 2010, he transferred within the Criminal Investigations Branch and assumed current duty as a homicide detective. In his free time, Brian enjoys spending time with his wife, children, mini pin dogs, I don't know what that is, traveling, and reading. Detective Schemenauer.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Detective Brian Schemenauer. I'm a master detective with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. I was asked to put together a presentation for you to kind of give you a little bit of an insight as to what goes into a homicide investigation, just how we conduct investigations in general. And we're going to be featuring the case involving DJ Thomas Keys, and also there was another victim in this particular case, Marvin Finney II. His nickname was DJ Freeze. These guys were rappers. They like to make music together. And so these two guys collectively were victims in this incident. So we're going to be featuring that case and kind of walking you through applying the principles of how we investigate a case towards a real homicide case. So let's see here. Yeah, could you switch it over for me? Thank you. So basically, in regards to when we begin an investigation, there's several steps that we kind of generally follow. We are notified initially of the investigation. We have a scene response. We identify and try to figure out who witnesses, possible suspects are. We will process the crime scene. Then the real bulk of the investigation is the investigative research, reviewing the evidence. That's the part of the investigation generally takes the longest. That's the bulk of the case, essentially. We prepare an affidavit for probable cause and a case file. We then will screen that case with the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. Warrants will be issued for those suspects if it's a situation that they deem that there's a probable cause for an arrest. We will then work towards apprehending the suspects in that investigation. And then the work begins with preparing that case for an actual criminal trial. So we have multiple meetings with the trial attorneys. And then, of course, the criminal court trial. So that's kind of just a real brief overview as to what all is involved step by step through the whole process. This particular homicide case that we're going to be talking about, this occurred at November 15, 2012. This happened at 2044 East 46th Street. It was a place called the One Stop Media. It was a recording studio that was actually owned by one of the co-defendants in the case, Carlton Hart. Victims in this case, again, Marvin Finney II and Thomas Keys. The defendants were a total of 6, ended up being Nathaniel Armstrong, Dominic Handler, James McDuffie, Dante Robinson, Carlton Hart, and Darren Jackson. So I guess the first part, we get the initial notification. The IMPD headquarters is in the City County building, the main building downtown. We are on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. So if you should ever need us for anything, that's where you'll find us. We respond citywide. So all the detectives in the homicide branch, we're not assigned to specific districts like some of the units. We respond wherever there's a case, and we will go and begin the investigation. Our branch is set up into 4 different branches. We have day shift, middle, late tactical, and late shift. I'm presently assigned to the late shift unit. It operates from 10:30 at night until 7 in the morning. So if it appears that I'm a little tired, that's probably why. In any case, that's also one of the more busier shifts. Although the caseloads attempt to distribute the cases equally among the branch. We operate on a rotating basis. So basically, the way it works is, for instance, if I'm up for a case tonight and I have to work a new case, then I become at the end of the queue, and everybody else in my shift is then up over me. So it gives us a little bit of time to be able to work our case, to do all that important work that has to be done as quickly as possible. So now we're going to talk about scene response. This particular case occurred at 8:08 p.m. On November 15th. We had received a report of a distressed subject that had appeared at the CVS pharmacy located at the corner of 46th Street and Keystone Avenue. He had evidence of being shot, confined with duct tape as well as zip ties. This person was later identified as Marvin Finney II, aka DJ Freeze. Marvin Finney was II was desperately trying to get something to be able to cut. He had a zip tie around his neck that was being used by the subjects to torture him, essentially, and was asking for staff as well as patrons, anybody at all that could help him try to remove that. So he had went inside the store and had went and obtained some scissors, was again trying to remove the ligature around his neck himself. Marvin Finney had directed officers rather quickly, saying that his cousin was actually at a recorded studio just west of the location on East 46th Street. His concern was with his cousin, who he believed was still there at the recording studio and possibly deceased. With that information, the responding officers immediately started their way west from that CVS location looking for a recording studio, and they had ended up finding that studio. Marvin Finney was transported to Methodist Hospital for those injuries. So these are actual crime scene photographs. You're kind of getting a glimpse of what the jury got to see regarding this case. This is the front entrance of the CVS pharmacy. The scissors are right there. You can see on the inside the aisle when he had ran inside the store. There's the duct tape that was used to. They had wrapped around his head. They had wrapped around part of his body. He still had some around his head, and there's the zip tie that was used to bind him as well. So then we had to kind of switch gears because the officers were told we have a secondary scene. So they proceeded to go find this one-stop media. They found a front door to that business unsecured. So they immediately went in, performed a protective sweep to see if they in fact had another victim at that location. They found a person bound, wrapped about his wrists, ankles, and neck with zip ties, additionally with duct tape about his head and body, also with apparent signs of gunshot wounds. This was the person that was later determined to be Thomas Keys. He was pronounced deceased at the scene, and a minivan that was rented by Marvin Finney was parked behind this business. So this is a crime scene photo of the one-stop media there at 2044 East 46th Street. It was a recording studio where the owner intended on having persons come over to record music. This is the rear of the business. This is the rental van that was used by Marvin Finney II, as well as Thomas Keys, to travel over to the location. So the next phase is, in this particular point, as the lead detective, I'm interested in trying to find out what information that we have regarding any witnesses that were there or the possibility of any suspects that are there. Unfortunately, obviously, we didn't have any suspects that had remained around, but we did have the victim and witness, Marvin Finney II. He was at Methodist Hospital. He was actively receiving medical treatment. And then we also had another witness that had showed up at the scene. We weren't sure if he was a witness or not, but that was Carlton Hart, the owner of the One Stop Media. He showed up unannounced at the scene, which was kind of surprising because it was not something that we were necessarily expecting him to show up at. We would have obviously sought him out to find out what he knew about what had happened at his business, but he had showed up and expressed a willingness to talk to us to share what information he had.
So again, Detective, Carlton Hart was the owner of the recording studio.
That's correct. What we did not have was we did not have any other eyewitnesses inside the studio besides the surviving victim, Marvin Finney II. That was the only person that was really ever able to tell us what happened inside that studio. There also, as I said, there unfortunately weren't any suspects apprehended at the scene. This particular point, my focus began to focus on interviewing those witnesses. Being that I was at the scene, I had delegated that responsibility in regards to Marvin Finney to Sergeant Brent Hendricks, who had responded to Methodist Hospital. Marvin Finney said that he and Keys had went to the studio together. He had advised that 5 to 6 unknown masked males had came to the studio and had proceeded to bind them with zip ties and tape. They began asking them about, they began questioning the two of them about a murder of a brother. And we were able to later figure out that this actually had some correlation to another homicide that had happened earlier on November 12th involving the murder of Brandon McMitchell, also known as Little Bango, who is also another one of these rapper performers. They were told by the suspects that they were going to die. They proceeded to torture them for 2 to 3 hours, including beating them and even cutting them with a box cutter. The suspects, towards the end of this incident, proceeded to turn out the lights, proceeded to shoot them repeatedly, and then they fled the studio. Marvin Finney, by the grace of God, managed to survive, and he played dead and waited until he had a moment that he felt that he could leave, and managed to get the bindings off and ran down the street and went to the CVS pharmacy. So while that was taking place with Sergeant Hendricks at the hospital, I proceeded to interview Carlton Hart downtown at the homicide office. And basically, at that particular point, I had no reason to believe he had any involvement whatsoever, just simply needed to get a statement from him. Carlton Hart stated that he had come to his studio after he had been contacted by some of his friends that his studio was surrounded by police. There was some police activity. You need to go over there and find out what's happening. He had advised me that nobody was supposed to be over at the studio. He said that it was closed, again, since the murder of Brandon Little Bango McMitchell, who was his cousin. That happened just a few days prior to the murder that happened at the studio. Carlton Hart stated he had no idea what happened. He said that he suspected someone had to break into his studio to get inside. That was a little problematic because there was no force damage to his studio. Carlton Hart, I asked him to walk me through his daily activities that day, which would be pretty standard in an investigation like this. And he basically had indicated that he had spent the day traveling about with his friend Darren Jackson. He was shopping for pants at a Goodwill and a Value Village. He said that was approximately 2 to 3 p.m. that day. And then he proceeded to drop Jackson off where Jackson worked at the Wendy's on Keystone Avenue, approximately 5 o'clock. Carlton Hart said that he then returned home, and he was at home the remainder of the time watching basketball games, and that he wasn't aware of anything else that had happened until he was alerted by these phone calls from his friends about the police activity over at his studio. Carlton Hart's initial statement became very, very important later in the investigation because it pointed to his direct involvement, the inconsistencies and the fact that things just didn't add up. And I've actually got a little bit of a statement, the words of Carlton Hart here for you, and I'll play those for you. And it's transcribed there.
So is that pretty much your whole day then, from start to finish?
That's it. I remember the day.
Okay.
I remember all of that.
And those were all the places that you went to? Okay. Did you spend any time with anyone other than Aaron?
I was with Aaron, that's pretty much it.
So again, he kind of placed himself with only one single individual, claimed that he was running some errands, and then he returned home. That was his story, which would, again, prove problematic for him later in the investigation. We're going to move on to crime scene processing. So IMPD has the benefit, we have the services of the Indianapolis Marion County Forensic Service Agency, which is more shortened to the crime lab. They are the ones that assist us with processing these complex crime scenes. There are some agencies that are smaller. The detectives may even have to process their own scenes. We're rather spoiled here in the IMPD because we have these crime scene specialists. They're civilians, they're not police officers, and they operate in conjunction with us to process these major felony crimes. They're not used on lesser crimes. They're used on these major violent, major felony crimes that typically involve violence. The crime scene specialists are trained in the latest evidence collection techniques, the latest advances in forensic collection. They're truly experts in their field. It's nice because for us, the crime lab operates independently of us. It's kind of, it insulates IMPD from accusations of improper investigation if someone were to suggest, crime scene tampering, planting evidence, things like that. This is an agency that operates independent of us, so it's just an additional safeguard that everybody's doing everything in the right way. This investigation was particularly complicated because we had more than one location. As I said before, it originally started over at the CVS pharmacy, and then we come to find out there was a secondary scene, the primary scene, which was over at the One Stop Media. So the documentation to include an investigation such as this, it's very all-encompassing. It has video, we have photography, collection and packaging of evidence, crime scene sketching. It's very time-intensive and tedious work. When we show up at the scene with the crime lab specialists, we're there for significant periods of time, hours. I don't remember exactly how long that I was here at this scene because sometimes I had to periodically leave, but suffice to say it was over the course of many hours to be able to process all of this evidence. But however, the thorough processing of the scene would later yield some significant benefits later in the investigation. So I have some photos of the interior. So again, here's the exterior of the One Stop Media Center. And then here's the interior. This is the recording booth where these guys perform their music. And this is on the other side, on the previous slide, you see that plexiglass window. So immediately on the other side is this room, and this is where the soundboard, the person that's putting together the project, that's conducting the project, this is where he operates. This is primarily where the majority of the incident had occurred, and you can see this, the markers, the yellow markers there, this is evidence that the crime scene person, the crime scene specialist has already come in. They've started to mark items of evidence and figuring out what items we're going to take and maybe process later. As you can see, there's the zip ties, the red article there is a box cutter, and over there in the corner on this, right over there, so that item there is a bag that at one time contained some of the zip ties, and that would prove to be very beneficial later in the investigation as well.
Detective, so what they know what they're referring to, so you're referring to item 36 and
Yes.
crime scene photo there.
Yes, this item over here, this was a discarded bag that had contained these zip ties, and they had just torn it open and just left the bag. So what you're looking at here is the rear doorway of the business. It's got these braces, and it's got a 2x4 that's wedged in there, and we believe obviously the intent was to prevent anyone from being able to come in and interrupt what was happening. You can see the staining there is from Marvin Finney attempting to get out unsuccessfully. At that time, he was injured, and he proceeded instead to have to run out the front door. This 2x4 would later become, and the brackets would become important later in the investigation as well. Here's a close-up picture of the zip ties, the bag, empty bag that was used, the instruments that was used to perform these acts against the victims. Next slides are going to be graphic, so if anybody has any aversions to looking at decedents, you might either excuse yourself or feel free to look away. I just wanted to at least forewarn people because the next photos will have images of Thomas Keys. So this is that same room that you had seen before, only it's pointing towards the rear of the business. And our decedent Thomas Keys is here along the edge, and I'll show you some other photos where you can see what's happened to him a little bit better. Again, crime scene has come, and they've already marked items of evidence. Suffice to say, we found spent cartridge casings, evidence of a gun being discharged. The shoes here actually belong to the victims. As they were as efforts were made to try to keep them confined in the business, the suspects had asked them to actually remove their shoes and also remove their pants. I think Marvin Finney at one time had reluctantly kicked off his shoes, but kept his pants. But the evidence of their shoes still being kicked off and left on the floor are still there. So this is another shot. Again, it's you can kind of see the soundboard and the various items of evidence. This is precisely how we saw it when we arrived. As you can see, there's no markers that were set by the crime lab people. Those yellow markers, which are used to itemize the items of evidence that we collect in the investigation. So this is precisely exactly how it looked when we arrived at the scene. Here's the victim, Thomas Keys. So this is a picture of Thomas Keys as the way we found him. As you can see, as kind of what I had described before, they had zip tied his wrists, they zip tied his ankles, they zip tied around his neck, they wrapped him in duct tape, they wrapped his head, his mouth, his eyes, just despicable. I mean, there's no real words for it. There's a close-up again of the way that they used to try to keep these guys confined, as they basically, the whole point of this, they were trying to get information from these two guys. They believed, this collective group believed that Thomas Keys and or Marvin Finney II had information about what had happened to their friend Brandon McMitchell, who was murdered a few days before. I never developed any information that either of these guys had anything to do with that or had any knowledge of that. So this kind of shows some of the efforts that's required of Crime Lab. So in addition to documenting video, photography, they complete what's called a sketch, crime scene sketch. And basically, it plots out all of the items of evidence. It's itemized. In this particular instance, probably the most pertinent of the crime scene is the multiple spent cartridge casings. There was a total of 7 9mm spent casings. We have glove wrappers, duct tape, zip ties, the wrappers for the zip ties, a box cutter, and obviously we recovered the body of Thomas Keys to take back to the Marion County Coroner's Office for additional examination and cause and manner death determination by the forensic pathologist. But it didn't stop there because, as I said, this one was more of a complicated incident. It spanned more than one scene. So over at the CVS, again, we performed, crime scene specialist performed another set scene sketch, thank you, and included additional items, the scissors, the duct tape, cable ties that were collected over at the CVS. And then also, this is the scene sketch that showed Thomas Keys, when he escaped from the confines of the one-stop video, he proceeded to run eastbound on East 46th Street, and he actually was trying to flag down cars. People, he even acknowledged, he said, I'm sure that I must have looked crazy because, you know, I had this tape all over my head, and I'm running and I'm bleeding and I'm trying to flag down help. And those markers, was a blood trail as he ran to go get help at the CVS. So that just kind of additionally substantiated exactly what he said happened, that it happened over there, and that he ran along the roadway and he went to the CVS to try to get help. I know I have some family here. Can you help me out with that? How old was Marvin Finney and Thomas.
Thomas was 22.
And Martin was 26.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
And if you could, we will have a period for questions afterwards, so if you could hold your questions, we will have the detective and Vanita answer all your questions when we finish.
Okay. So getting back to that evidence, so I made mention about that deposited bag became a really, really crucial piece of evidence early in this investigation. At the time, there was a phone app on my phone that allowed you to scan a barcode, and this particular app allowed you to determine the source of wherever that merchandise is sold. I was fortunate because that particular bag of these zip ties was an exclusive item sold by Lowe's. So that was particularly helpful in determining some suspect information. So we kind of proceeded from the crime scene processing to that bulk, the difficult part of now we're having to review the evidence and we're having to do the investigative research. As I said before, we had the evidence with the zip ties, so I had that avenue that I could pursue. I wasn't certain at that particular point that Marvin Finney II was going to be particularly helpful to be able to identify suspects because he had said these guys were masked. So I wasn't sure that was going to be the best use of my time. So what I focused on was that bag and finding out about maybe I could get lucky at the Lowe's. So I began examining the various locations of Lowe's throughout the city of Indianapolis. There's one that happens to be very close to where this had happened at 62nd and Keystone. It's actually on Rural. It's very close to both these scenes, so I prioritized that location first. I went to that location and I sought out the loss prevention officer there, the manager, and that turned out to be a significant break in the case. So I had inquired with the loss prevention manager if he had happened to seen any peculiar purchases. Anybody purchasing duct tape, anybody purchasing zip ties, on the chance that maybe he might have some information about that, however remote. And it was interesting because the LP manager, his eyes immediately got big, and I knew that he saw something. And he had said that he had seen suspicious persons. He had actually seen suspicious persons on the 15th, that afternoon, and said that there were 3 black males that had come inside the business, and he had deemed that it was odd the kinds of things that they were purchasing, specifically a 2x4 piece of wood, a box cutter, zip ties, and duct tape. And it was interesting because the manager told me, he said, what kind of possible home project would you be working on that would utilize those kinds of items? It was suspicious to him, and certainly he, throughout the course of the remainder of their visit inside his store, he followed them via the cameras. He was in the LP room. The cameras there in the Lowe's are very, very sophisticated, and they have the ability to pan and zoom, and I couldn't have asked for better surveillance video unless I told him to do it, this was just all by chance. The LP manager originally said his attention was drawn to these guys because immediately when they walked in, they picked up a box cutter. And typically that's used by persons that are looking to shoplift. They'll open up boxes and maybe they'll stuff other things in the box, and then they'll go out and fail to pay, or they can cut security countermeasures off of things. So that was what originally alerted him to start watching these guys, but the things that they were purchasing alarmed him much more. As they continued to shop, he utilized all their interior as well as their exterior cameras to monitor their actions. These purchases occurred November 15, 2012 at 3:18 p.m. And just to put that in perspective, the first inbound 911 call was made at 8:08 p.m. when Marvin Finney had sought help at the CVS pharmacy. So this was literally on the same day, literally hours before the call for help came in. These subjects would all eventually be identified to be Carlton Hart, James McDuffie, and Darren Jackson. And I'll show you some video stills. So as you can see, really, really good video. Who you see there on the left in the polo shirt, that's Darren Jackson, one of the co-defendants. The one there in the middle, that's Carlton Hart. He's the owner of the One Stop Video. So he was with these guys when these purchases were made. The guy in the middle, Yeah, that's Carlton Hart in the dark, in the middle. The guy in the far right, he's not related to this incident. So, so here's another image, and the one that's in the dark with the cap there, that's James McDuffie. And you saw from the previous photo, that's Darren Jackson in that polo shirt. The LP manager, as he was watching these guys go throughout the store, he was particularly observed. He's watching this on live video, and he could see that Darren Jackson and James McDuffie were discussing zip ties. And you could actually see from the detail of these cameras exactly what they had. The LP manager knew precisely what aisle this was and what items were carried in this aisle. James McDuffie had originally selected smaller, thinner zip ties. But you can tell that in the course of this conversation with Darren Jackson, they have a conversation about selecting instead a thicker style of zip ties. It was ironic to the LP manager because he had indicated these larger style thick zip ties, he hardly ever sells them because they're just so big. It would take large wires for that kind of a project. So he hardly ever sold them. So it's rather peculiar that they were even buying these anyway. But what happens in the next moment is kind of what really does it for him. So as the LP manager is watching this conversation, he's holding the zip ties, it becomes clearer what these guys were going to do with these zip ties. And I don't know if you can see it very well.
Oh my God.
See how his hands are like that? Right up there. So he's explaining that these are the proper means. These are going to do a better job to bind his hands. So it was very evident to the LP manager exactly what these guys were talking about, and it was not any sort of a home project. Additionally, as I said, they followed these guys around. As I said, I couldn't have asked for better video. I couldn't have, if I had told them that I wanted these guys monitored. There's the black zip ties, there's the white zip ties, there's the duct tape. This is McDuffie pushing the cart, and there's Darren Jackson. And don't forget that Carlton Hart's still in the mix. So there's a 2x4, and you may have remembered they're on the back of they're on the back door of the premises. He had a 2x4. Well, he would cut that, and he would use that to help bar the rear door.
So Detective, this is Carlton Hart, then on the right there.
Carlton Hart and James McDuffie there. There's Carlton and there's McDuffie. So then as it goes on, here they are at checkout. Carlton Hart later responded to some of the information he was given later that'll become pretty important. That's why it's so beneficial that we had all these actions all documented by video. But you can clearly see that he's a part of this transaction. He's seen what's happening. He knows what's happening. He knows what's being purchased. And here's another shot. You can see there's Darren Jackson, there's Carlton Hart, McDuffie. There's Darren Jackson. There's McDuffie, and there's Carlton Hart. And we even had exterior camera. So there they are on the way out of the store, having completed their purchases. It even shows them getting into Carlton Hart's vehicle. He was driving a Ford Crown Victoria at the time, red in color, and they all got into the vehicle together. This wasn't a deal that everybody just happened to wind up at the same place. They all drove together. This was a combined effort. James McDuffie even made it a little bit better for me because then we started pursuing some of the transactions. This is a sales receipt for the purchase made on Lowe's on November 15th, just hours before the crime. Numerous items that we recovered at the scene of the homicide. The white zip ties, the black zip ties, the utility knife, the 2x4 piece of lumber, the electrical duct tape, the bar holders for the wood. They were all found at the crime scene. And they're all right here on this purchase, hours before. And down here at the bottom, you'll see here it says merch gift card. So, merch gift card. right there. Well, that was particularly useful because we were also able to backtrack, and we went back to a merchandise return, which was made on November 3rd, 2013. This is a standardized procedure that Lowe's does. Whenever somebody loses a receipt or if they have merchandise, they want to get your information, they want to know who you are, and they don't just give out cash. They'll give you a credit, a store credit, to document the return of that merchandise and returning your money. They have a procedure which requires proof of identification. This in-store credit was issued to James McDuffie. The receipt signature on this receipt is James McDuffie. It even has his Indiana driver's license number, his address, his name there. Everything to document the fact that he's the one that's behind this in-store credit. And this credit was used to make the purchases on November 15th.
Detective, how would you explain how you would have gotten a copy of the receipt in this return?
So basically, in talking to the LP manager, I had expressed interest that this would be valuable evidence. I'd indicated that this was what I'd like to have is copies of those receipts. He was the manager at the Lowe's was very cooperative throughout the investigation, helped in every way possible. He testified in all the trials. He just did a fantastic job. So Lowe's had fantastic records. Everything worked out perfectly to be able to help bolster this case. We continued on with the investigative research, that bulk section, the part that takes the longest. So now after I had done this work here at the Lowe's, I turned my attention back towards Marvin Finney II because I hadn't talked to him yet, and I wanted to speak to him directly. He had some time to think about things. He had a few days to think about it, and I think that was particularly beneficial because it was kind of evident that he needed some cool down time. He needed to, praise God that he was still alive and he was still here with us. He had indicated that at that time I went to meet with him. I wasn't anticipating a whole lot from Marvin Finney. In fact, I was anticipating getting pretty much the same story what he told Sergeant Hendricks, that he was detained by these 5 to 6 masked individuals, and I didn't think I was going to be able to get much from him. However, Marvin Finney II had a lot of support from his family, his mother in particular, and through his own courage, he had a much more different story to tell me when I met with him. And so I will kind of walk through you what he advised me in this interview. So Marvin Finney II had advised me that he had been contacted by Thomas Keyes in a phone call, said that Thomas Keyes had asked Marvin to go with him over to the One Stop Media, that he had received an invitation, he didn't say from whom, but an invitation to go over to the One Stop Media to work on a new recording project. Marvin Finney II had went and picked up Thomas Keyes in the minivan, and they proceeded to arrive at the studio. Finney II advises that he and Keyes had been allowed into the rear, that picture from the rear of the business, had been allowed into the rear by a subject that Finney II knew as D-Rob. So this wasn't a deal that the guys were masked. This wasn't a deal that he didn't know who they were. He absolutely knew who they were. I think he was probably scared. In any case, Finney and Keyes were led into the recording area of the business. They were then joined in that studio by James McDuffie, who you've also seen was at the Lowe's picking up the various items. McDuffie began inquiring about the murder of Bango to both of them. And specifically, he said, I want to know what you know about the murder of little Bango. McDuffie began brandishing a pistol during the course of that conversation. And it became apparent to Marvin that this was a situation. They weren't there to come and work on a project. They had lured them there for the purpose of trying to extract information or see what information they knew about the murder of Lil Bango. Marvin Finney attempted to leave. He attempted to go out the back door, but he was stopped by another armed subject. Then the dynamic changed. They had property taken from both of them. These guys proceeded to take from both Finney and from Keys, money, keys, phones, and a laptop computer. At that time, Marvin was asked to take off his shoes, take off his pants. He complied with the shoes. As the questioning continued, it got more and more hostile. It was apparent that they were not going to be satisfied unless they got the answers that they felt that they were entitled to. The group was then joined by a subject that Marvin had recognized as Scooter, and that's the nickname for Dominic Hamler. Scooter came in and he was armed with an assault type rifle. Again, he was very agitated. He was quoted, "Which one of you killed Bango? You better tell us. You ain't making it home tonight." Marvin and Thomas Keys were both overpowered by the group. They were tied down with the zip ties around their ankles and their wrists. The group was last joined by a subject that Marvin had recognized as Little Nate, who was Nathaniel Armstrong. Little Nate was the one that, according to Marvin, had got everybody amped up. He was the most out of control, the most upset of all of them. He was apparently very close to Brandon Mitchell. Marvin and Keys were bound with duct tape at that time about their heads, their mouth, over their eyes. And they were still questioned despite the fact they couldn't even answer. They could no longer answer with the tape being over their mouth. They were just trying to be as cruel as possible. They were both punched and tortured. As I said, there was evidence of Thomas being cut with the box cutter. There was open discussions by the captors talking about electrocuting them, drowning them, burning them alive. They had placed zip ties around both of their necks as this torture continued. There was evidence of petechial hemorrhage, so this was causing restrictions with the circulatory system. They were actually trying to choke them. They had put both of those on both Marvin and Thomas. At that point, I guess the pinnacle of what was about to happen was happening. According to Marvin, they started to file out of the room, except for one. And the only detail that Marvin was able to say was that the subject had dreads and he was armed with a chrome-type handgun. And he said that that was the detail he was able to see with the obscured vision that he had with the tape over his eyes. And he put his arms up as he was shot, and both he and Thomas were shot multiple times. He felt being struck in the wrist as it was he had held it up above his head to kind of protect his face. He said he played dead. He didn't move until the suspects had left. When he believed it was safe, he managed to find a screwdriver, was able to free himself of his bindings. His concern went to Thomas, where he went and checked to see his status and was unresponsive. At that point, he got out of the studio and he ran to get help. I'd asked Marvin, I said, in your previous statement, you said that all these captors were all masked, and, now this is very different. It was something that certainly we were going to have to explain later. But he responded very genuinely, and he had said, at the moment that all this had just happened, I just wanted to be left alone. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was tell everybody what happened, was to be questioned by the police about it. So in essence, I think it was good that I gave him those few days with his family, with time to reflect on what happened. Marvin did a fantastic job throughout this whole process, as well as having to relive and telling me on more than one occasion and having to identify these persons. It just took a lot of courage on his part. So Marvin did provide detailed physical descriptions of each person. He advised them that he knew them because all these guys were all in this music industry. They were all trying to aspire to be rappers and make themselves a music career. So with that, now that we had ideas of who these individuals are, my job became a little easier, because then it was a matter of preparing what's called photo arrays. So this is a photo array. This is an investigative technique that we have when we're attempting to see if a person can identify a person of interest or a suspect. it's not proper, and it wouldn't be fair for us to simply just show one photo and say, is this the guy, if we think it's him, and then there's a 50-50 chance. So this is more of a more fair procedure that we have. It consists of 6 photos. Our obligation is to make it fair, so we have to pick, persons that resemble the person in question, so similar features. You don't want to have somebody standing out that, that clearly doesn't look like the rest. You got to make it fair. This particular one was the defendant, Nathaniel Armstrong, the middle and the bottom, number 5, right there. He had some scarring on his face, made it very easily distinguishable. These other guys had different scarring about their faces as well, again, to make it fair. It didn't take long for Marvin to look at the photo array and said, number 5. There's his signature right below it. So little Nate was done. So then we moved on to number 2. This here is Dominic Hamler, aka Scooter. Number 4, Dominic Hamler, Scooter. Didn't take him long. He looked right at it. He's seen these guys before. He's bumped into them. He's been to concerts together. He knows these guys. There's his signature. He identified him. So Dominic Hamler was done. Now this one was a little more difficult for Marvin, and I'm not exactly sure why, but in any case, subject of interest is number 2 here. That's James McDuffie. Subject number 2, James McDuffie. And what you'll notice is there's no signature below number 2 there, right? His signature is actually along the left side of the page. Marvin wasn't actually able to identify him positively. He selected him. When I showed him this, he says, I think it's number 2, but I'm not 100%. 100% is not 100%. And I don't advise any one of my victims or witnesses to put their name to something if they're not 100%. This is a serious matter. We don't want to falsely identify somebody. Fortunately, in this particular case, we had the benefit of James being one of the ones that was shopping for the murder equipment, as well as using a receipt that he had in his name. So that was able to shore that up. Then we have D-Rob. This is Dante Robinson. They're in the middle, bottom row, Dante Robinson, D-Rob. Again, he's seen him before, seen him in clubs, seen him at different venues. He knew him, he identified him, he put his name to him. Dante Robinson was identified, he was done. So, really came together when I got in front of him and he had time to think about it, and it was interesting because this wasn't a situation that I wouldn't have been able to get the 4 guys if Marvin had been cooperative with me and came off of his initial assessment that these guys were masked. If he had wanted to handle it himself, if he was just too scared, if he didn't, if he felt like he was snitching, something along those lines, I wouldn't have been able to be able to prove my case against these guys. Consequently, I also wouldn't have known about the other guys' involvement, the video evidence that we had. That was equally important and crucial to this case. I kind of refocused my efforts on November 26th. I was actually contacted by Carlton Hart. He contacted me. On that date, he said that he wanted to share some additional details with me. And he said that he was receiving death threats himself. He advised that he was a marked man and that he was labeled a snitch, which is ironic because he didn't really tell on anybody. He had requested, I requested Carlton Hart. I said, can you walk me through again what you did that day, the day that the murder happened in your studio? And pretty much it was the same exact story of what he had reported before. He made no mention at any time that he was in the company of James McDuffie that day. He made no mention of going to the Lowe's, which was used to purchase those supplies that were used in those criminal acts. Very telling. Following that, we kind of get to the part where now I was moving past the bulk of the difficult portion. I've reviewed the evidence. I've got photo arrays. I've got identity of various individuals confirmed. I've got video evidence. I've got all the forensics are in progress or being completed. So at this particular point, I began preparing what's called a probable cause for affidavit, as well as completing a case file. So this, yes, sir.
Inject here.
Sure.
Let's cover that next week on the preparation of case file and the screening process.
Absolutely.
And jump ahead to warrants issue.
Sure, absolutely.
We'll cover the preparation of the probable cause and screening next week.
Absolutely. So following completion of formal screening, formal criminal charges are filed. They'll issue a warrant for the suspect's arrest. That's issued by a judicial officer. At that point, that's when we as law enforcement officers can effect that and serve that warrant anytime we come into contact with that suspect. The apprehension of the suspects, we move into that phase where we have the additional benefit, again, being a larger department, having specialty units. We work in conjunction with specialty units within our own department as well as external agencies. Within our own department, we have a group called the Violent Crimes Unit, or VCU. We also have U.S. Marshal liaisons that additionally are able to travel about and look for those that may have fled the state. These guys are amazing. They're very highly skilled, uniquely trained, and these guys are specialized in apprehending somebody that doesn't want to get caught. And they have a variety of techniques. I would love to share them with you. Some of their work is they like to keep to themselves. It's legal, but it's a situation that they don't want to necessarily advertise their methods and their means of trying to track people down, but they are very, very creative. Okay. It was interesting. On November 29th, I came into contact with Carlton Hart again. This time I had a warrant in hand, so it was a much different atmosphere. This was an interrogation. This was no longer an interview. At this time, I had already presented my case to the prosecutor's office. The warrant was filed, so this is requiring me to Mirandize him. Ironically enough, Carlton agreed to give me a statement, so I was able to actually try to get some additional details from him. He eventually admitted, okay, well, I had been at the studio the day of the murder. He said that he was in the company of Darren Jackson. He said that he was aware that the victims had pulled up in their van, but at that moment, he immediately left. That was his story. He said that James McDuffie was riding with someone else in another vehicle, which, contrary to what evidence that I had, that he was with, Carlton Hart was with these two other individuals right before it happened. Carlton Hart claims that James McDuffie had told him, I'm going to have a meeting with some guys. Basically, that's he left it at that. He said that he observed James McDuffie have a gun, and he was scared of McDuffie. That's what he's saying this time. Never mentioned this before. So, but the biggest problem with that revised version of the last statement that I had with him was that he made no mention that he went with McDuffie and Jackson to that Lowe's. So that was a very telling point. I've got some audio real quick of some of that statement. Maybe. Okay, well, apparently it doesn't, but as you can see here, he's talking about that he was riding with someone else when we know that that isn't true. He was riding, McDuffie was riding with him just hours before. Here's another portion of his statement. James goes to my studio with them dudes in the beige long car. He goes in, he said he was just gonna have a meeting with some dudes who he think did it. He's talking about the murder of Brandon McMitchell. So I'm telling him, you're not getting ready to do shit in my building. You're not about to have no meeting in my building. I swear to God on my life, I got scared. He promised me he was gonna lock up my building when he got done with the meeting. That's what he's worried about, is locking up his business.
James goes up to my studio with the dudes in the beige long car. He goes in and he said, "You just gonna have to
Okay, so December 6th, he still wasn't done trying to explain himself. He's still trying to crawl out of this hole that he created. Carlton Hart met with Marion County Sheriff's officers, deputies, while he was in custody, and he provided an additional revised statement. He was reacting now. By this time, he was aware that he was captured on video at the Lowe's. So now he's got a real problem.
He would have known that because through his counsel, he would have seen the probable cause affidavit was decided.
That's correct.
Right?
Yes. So now this is interesting because although he knows that there's video, he doesn't know what the video shows. He doesn't know the extent of how good the video is. So I'll play for you what he said here.
And the reason why I'm sitting here now is because I went to Lowe's with him to get some security stuff for my building. And while I was there getting that, and I'm pretty sure they could see on the camera that he had already purchased that stuff. I went behind him. I didn't really care to even think what he had in his bag. But as I look back, I can tell that he was kind of like concealing it from me a little bit.
So you guys saw the still video, and it didn't look like he was really hiding much of anything, was he? So you may wonder, I mean, I got a lot on Carlton Hart talking. I attempted to interrogate all the rest of the defendants, however they requested attorneys, so I don't have any insight as to what their viewpoints of what had happened was.
So when a defendant is given, or suspect's given their Miranda rights, which includes the right to talk to attorneys, they say, I want to talk to attorney, you have to stop.
That's correct. So they requested attorneys, and my attempt to gather additional information from them was over at that point. Interestingly enough, throughout this entire process, the court trials, the appeals process to present day, none of these guys, with the exception of maybe Carlton Hart, had ever told on anyone. These guys, they took their lumps and they took their sentences and they're done. We prepared long and hard for this trial. As the defendant's cases moved through the system, I had ongoing meetings with the lead trial prosecutor, Deputy Prosecutor Ross Anderson, just an amazing individual, did a fantastic job. He had tremendous stamina to go through this. And I don't want to trudge too much upon his efforts. You'll have a fascinating insight as to the challenges that his presenting this case proved to be in court. But suffice to say, we had pretrial event meetings, depositions, suppression hearings, things of that sort. We had to review lab reports as some of the labs came back. Additional investigation to any new facts, any new witnesses, anything at all, that has to still be investigated. Just because somebody's arrested doesn't mean the case is over, the investigation's over. We still have to investigate. The investigation process doesn't end. Even through the court, there's some times that I'm doing something related to a case. Up until the conclusion of that trial, you could learn something that could potentially be beneficial.
Is it pretty common, Detective, as once the case is filed, and obviously you're interacting with our deputy prosecutor, through that interaction to sort of jointly come up with other ideas and things to follow up on?
Absolutely. This is especially at that stage, it's really a collaborative effort between the detective and the prosecutor. I've gotten to be very close to a lot of these guys and women that they work long hours, and it's especially on the major felony cases. It's a grueling process. There's so much evidence. This was just a snapshot of everything that went into this case. There's so much that you didn't even. I'm limited, and I know I'm over time. I apologize, but there's so much that goes into this case that there was additional statements from other people that may have heard something. Additional people that may have came forward with additional information that they had heard. Labs that come back, any number of different things. Everything has to be investigated, and in particular, cellular phone reports. So, I mean, I did various search warrants on various defendants' cell phones, seeing where they were showing up in various parts of the city and so forth. Can't even get into all that, but rest assured, we left no stone unturned. We try to be as absolutely thorough as we can because the stakes are very high in this. This is justice for the victims and as well as their families. So,
why don't you cover the importance of victim and witness participation?
Absolutely. So the big message that I'd like to get to all of you tonight, success in this case, was in largely part to the courage and trust that Marvin Finney placed in me and the IMPD, that we were going to aggressively pursue the people, do the right thing. In many other cases that I've also had, victims and witnesses may not choose to participate in the criminal justice process for any variety of reasons that I touched upon before. Maybe they fear retaliation. That's very real, and I understand that. A desire to handle matters themselves, which that's not good. That doesn't solve the problem. That just wrecks more lives and ruins more people. The stigma of being labeled a snitch. A snitch used to be something that would be labeled to a person that maybe was in jail and was trying to work off their punishment. And now it seemed to morph into this situation that somebody that's an innocent person just happens to be living in the community and they witness something and they tell the police that that person's a snitch. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. Police agencies can only encourage someone to participate in the legal process to acquire justice for the victims and the families. We can just tell people, please, work with us. And hopefully we can work on establishing that trust and continue to make improvements in that regard. But I think, and I don't know how to solve it, but this is what I think. I think we need to promote a societal culture that champions those with the courage to come forward. The people that reject the violence in their communities, that recognize cooperative victims and witnesses in these horrible matters. These are the heroes. These are not snitches. So,
Hold your questions.
sure. I'd like to thank Prosecutor Terry Curry, Annie Kern, the rest of the Marion County prosecuting staff for their hard work and the opportunity to speak to all of you today. There's so much material. Like I said, I tried to condense it down. I still went over. But it was an honor and a pleasure to speak to all of you. Hopefully you gathered something out of this today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Curry. Thank you all very much.
Hold tight there. Going to a couple more things. First of all, there are family members here tonight of Thomas Keyes and Marvin Finney, and so after Vanita speaks, if you would like to do so, I'd like the family members to identify themselves when we get to that point. A couple points related to the detective's presentation. Number one, obviously we did know that these cases involve graphic pieces of evidence. And we talked about that, but we felt it important that we not sanitize this, that you understand what the detective sees and what's involved in these horrible violent crimes. And secondly, the thing that really jumped out at me, the detective said, was that this can be tedious work. And that's really kind of the fundamental message that we want you to get out of this, is that it's not all glamorous work at all. And if these things are to be done correctly by our police investigators, by our deputy prosecutors, it is long, arduous, tedious work to get to the result that we want. We're going to hear from Vanita Farrow here also, and then after Vanita's done, again, if the family members could identify themselves, and then Vanita and the detective can answer some questions you might have. Vanita has been with the Marion County Prosecutor's Office for 29 years and currently serves as sex crimes, child abuse paralegal, and administrator of the Special Victims Unit. Our Special Victims Unit is a unit that covers sex crimes, child abuse, and domestic violence. For 17 and a half years in the office, Vanita worked passionately as a homicide victim advocate. She assisted the families of homicide victims and other cases involving serious bodily injury and death throughout the criminal justice process and conclusion of the case. On a personal note, Vanita enjoys listening to contemporary jazz and going on many fishing excursions with her fiancé. I've said it in other settings, and it is not BS. Our victim advocates are indispensable, absolutely indispensable to what we do. Vanita?
Good evening, everyone. I promise not to take too long because I know that you guys have a ton of questions for Brian and about his investigation. I promise not to hold you on. After the assigned detective meets with one of the screeners in our office, and charging decisions have been made. The case is filed in one of the 6 criminal courts. And then the file is forwarded to the paralegal in our office, who is also assigned to that court, for file workup and the discovery process. A part of the file workup, of a paralegal's file workup, is preparing a victim advocate referral. And what that referral consists of is a victim's name, next of kin information, charges filed, initial trial date, and some other information that we use as victim advocates. In most cases, after charges are filed, and in some instances beforehand, a victim advocate is one of the first people from our office to make initial contact with a victim and or a victim's family. In the 17 and a half years that I worked as a victim advocate, I cannot remember making a phone call to a family who wasn't experiencing some degree of crisis, shock, disbelief, anger, sadness, and grief. As a victim advocate, it requires undue compassion, patience, and understanding. During the first of many calls to come, I'd make my introduction to my family, conduct an informal needs assessment, and identify any appropriate referrals and outside resources that may be able to help my victim's family throughout the process. I'd also, during this call, advise the family of any upcoming court hearings, try to answer as many of their questions as I could, and as you can imagine, most families had a ton of questions. Again, a lot of those questions I tried to answer. Some of those questions I could not answer. However, I did assure them that at some point their questions would be answered. In addition to that, I also would schedule a meeting for the victim and or victim's family to come into our office to meet with the assigned prosecutor and myself for additional information regarding the case and the criminal justice process. We call these family meetings in murder cases. And this is usually when formal introductions are made, additional contact information between the family and the prosecutorial team are made, and the prosecutor at that time will go over the charges that have been filed. He will explain those charges. He or she will explain those charges to the family. He or she will also, explain some of the facts of the case, excluding anything that may be related to evidence. Prosecutor will also explain possible sentences and penalties if found guilty, how long the family can anticipate it will be before their case goes to trial, and what the family can expect to happen over the next several months. At that point, as a victim advocate, I would explain to the family what my role would be again as their victim advocate, share any referrals for grief counseling and resource information, additional information about the criminal justice process, and also what they can expect. I also let the family know at that time that I would do everything in my power to help keep them informed of court hearings, any case status updates, schedule meetings for the family with the prosecutor if and when needed. And most importantly, just to always be available for that family and to attend court hearings with them and attend the trial with them. As I said again, just act as support for that family as they go through that journey through the criminal justice process, which, oh my God, you guys, can be long and daunting. And Harold and Debbie and Valerie, and even Nicole back there, can attest to that. Very frustrating. One thing I wanted to just kind of tell everybody, this is a question or something that I used to encounter often as a victim advocate with a family. Everybody believes that a suspect is arrested on the same day. The suspect is tried and convicted on the same day, and it's over. That's so far remotely from the truth. It takes anywhere for just a homicide that involves one defendant. It can take anywhere from 6 months to a year before that homicide case is resolved. Real quickly, after I remember that day that I received the referral in the case where Marvin and Thomas were the victims. I had attended a sentencing with a victim who didn't have any family, and she didn't want to be alone in the courtroom. So I attended that sentencing with her. After that sentencing, I remember going back over to my office, and I had received a new referral. And every time I received a new referral, I knew, especially on murders, I knew that I was going to have to allot as much time as possible. I never rushed people as a victim advocate on the telephone nor in person, because I wanted to hear what my families had to say. I wanted to know what they were feeling. I wanted to know what I could do to help them. But anyway, I remember sitting at my desk and I read the charging information and I read the lengthy PC, and as usual, I was horrified. Totally horrified. And immediately my heart went out to, of course, Thomas, who succumbed to his injuries, and to our survivor, Marvin. I also thought about the families. I didn't know what the outcome of the case was going to be, but what I did know for sure was that with this 6-defendant case, we could potentially have 6 trials that my victim's family and Marvin and his family would have to go through, which means more than 6 months, more than a year. From experience, I know what that does to family. I've seen what that does to families. So I did know that for sure. I also knew that there would be several continuances of trial settings. Frustrating. I also knew that there would be various court hearings. We've got 6 defendants, 6 different attorneys. it was going to be a long time. And Thomas's family and Marvin's family was in for a long haul. And I knew, as the victim advocate assigned to this case, I needed to give them everything that I had. You know, I tried to do the best I could and to be there for them and to support this family. And another thing that I knew for sure was that Thomas's family, Debbie and Harold, Thomas' children, his siblings, Marvin, Valerie, his dad, his children, family and friends, their lives had been turned upside down. In life, nothing about life would ever be the same again, ever. So with that being said, as a victim advocate assigned to this case, I tried to keep the family updated as best I could. I also, this was not mandatory, I was not required to do it, but for years, because I wanted to, I gave my families my personal cell phone number. I wanted my families to know that we not only worked from 8 to 5, everyone in the prosecutor's office, we work nonstop, sometimes 24/7. And I wanted my families to be able to call me if they had questions, if they had attended court earlier that day, or they heard something on the streets, or they heard something from a neighbor, whatever. If they wanted to vent, frustrated, whatever, they just needed my ear or my shoulder. I had them. So I did do that, which means I did work a lot around the clock. But as a victim advocate, that's what I did. That's what I did, and I was passionate about that. One thing, finally, I'd like to say is, as a victim advocate and doing that job for as long as I did, I've met a lot of people, met all kinds of people. I didn't care what race they were. Advocates don't care what race you are. We don't care. We don't care where you live. We don't care how much money you make, socioeconomic status. We don't care about any of that. All I know is that either you are a victim of crime or a family member of yours has been a victim of crime, and you need support. You need someone that's going to be there for you, and they're going to walk with you through the criminal justice process. And that is what I've always tried to do. And finally, these few words was my guiding force every day as a homicide victim advocate. People will forget what you said. People will even forget what you do. But people will never forget how you made them feel. And that, as a victim advocate, that's what I always try to do.
If you could Thomas' family members, Marvin's family members identify yourself?
Harold Keys, Thomas's father.
Deborah Watson, Thomas's mother.
Harold Keys, the oldest brother.
Justin Keys, Thomas' brother.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. All right, we're going to have Detective and Vanita back up here and answer any questions you have. We'll not, since it's now 20 till 8, we'll not take too many questions. We'll take some questions. Then all of you veterans know, if you stick around, we'll draw some names for door prizes. And then we'll wrap up for this evening. So, any questions? You can.
All right, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm curious, my understanding is that, correct me if I'm wrong, that the defense attorney or attorneys have a right to know whatever it is that the prosecutor knows. So my question had to do with, for example, the store video. Okay, so in the probable cause, you said that they knew that there was video. Did they know, were they able to, when did they see it? When were they able to see the
Hey,
video?
Carolyn, why don't we save that question for next week for the deputy prosecutors, because they can explain the discovery process and how that would have been gone. Is that all right? Good.
Remember Carol.
Carolyn will remember. I can't guarantee you that.
If you're resolving 40,000 cases in a year, how many cases is each of the victim advocates covering?
When I was a victim advocate, I was assigned to 3 courts, and at the time of this particular murder case, if I remember correctly, I had like 80. Yes, ma'am.
Our victim advocates will be assigned thousands of cases in any given year, but those are primarily victim-sensitive cases such as sex crimes, homicide. So 40,000, a lot of those are minor offenses, public intoxication, that sort of thing. So it's really the major felony cases where there is a true victim where our victim advocates then work with them.
And of that, of my caseload, a lot of those cases were homicide cases. And so those cases were with me for a while, at least 6 months to a year. And in the case of DJ Keys and Marvin's, it was around for, a couple years.
Yes, ma'am.
I am so sorry for this family, and I thank you both for what you do. I would like to know more about how do you apply for that position to be a victim advocate, but how do you keep from just throwing up when you see this stuff, because even you describing it, it made me feel so bad. How do you get past that?
I'll let you answer that.
I love people.
Yes.
And the compassion that I have for people is great. I don't think that anybody can just be a victim advocate in the prosecutor's office. I think it has to be innate. You just have to have a passion for it. This is what you want to do, and you want to help people. You want to help these victims and families to understand the criminal justice process, because it's confusing. There are a lot of twists and turns. There are, a lot of different paths a case can take. So, having an advocate there, to support you and to help answer questions along with the prosecutor and the paralegal. There's a team, not just me. But, just having, a team that, you're able to, to contact and, not have to set appointments for, and even having someone that you can call after business hours helps. But, again, I've just been doing it for a long time, and I just have a passion.
Yeah, if I can add something to that, because I think probably true of Detective Schemenauer and Vanita and all of us here. No one becomes a police officer because they're going to get rich being a police officer. No one works in our prosecutor's office because they're going to get rich. But what makes our job worthwhile is exactly this, is just getting to the point where you have the gratification and satisfaction that you have achieved an appropriate result in any given case. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I wanted to ask her, do you guys, are you provided with any type of therapy? Or, like, I want to know if they're provided therapy because they're going through.
The Victim Advocate Unit?
Yes, yes.
It's available, if that's needed. What some victim advocates do suffer from is vicarious traumatization. That does occur. Me personally, I have outlets that help me. I enjoy listening to jazz. I enjoy water fountains. I enjoy fishing, those types of things. And I don't take photos home. I don't take crime scene videos home. Yeah, you can't. And again, I've been doing it for a long time, and it's one of my loves. So.
Let's take a couple more questions, and then I'm sure Detective Anita would hang around if you have any individual questions. But let's take a couple more, and then we'll move on. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you a question, Detective.
Yes.
So what is your caseload and how do you keep track? Because you have to do such a detailed investigation. So do you carry more than one caseload at a time, or do you focus in on one case?
As a homicide detective, we actually, our duties go beyond just strictly a true homicide case. We respond to incidents of suicide, accidental deaths, obviously the homicides where we spend the bulk of our time, natural deaths at times, and sometimes it's not real clear. If it's a suspicious circumstance, we're not really clear what it is. We've got a terrible opioid problem. We're having a lot of overdoses, heroin. I think that's one of the subjects here that's going to be talked about. We respond to all those kinds of incidents. So in addition to our homicide caseload, we have other cases that we respond to, we investigate, we make sure what it is, so that we can make sure that the families are satisfied that this is what happened. But as far as caseloads themselves, it varies. It kind of, we have a little bit of fluctuation. I usually average anywhere between 8 to 10 cases, homicide cases a year. It seems that I have difficulties putting down maybe 2 cases a year. So I've presently, as far as open homicide cases, I think I have about 20 open cases right now. And that's over the course of, I'll have 8 years in homicide in March. So
take one more question, and if you have any additional questions, we'll catch them afterwards.
Yes.
First, I'd like to ask you, how is your son doing?
God is good, because people don't know this. Thomas.
Could you stand up and speak so everyone can hear you?
Thomas and Marvin, the week before that happened, weren't registered to the school. And Marvin just graduated from that school 5 months ago. So,
and I would like to say to the parents and to the family, I'm a victim. I say I'm a victim because my son was shot and killed in 2013, and I dealt with Ms. Benita, and I can say she's wonderful.
She is amazing.
Sometimes it doesn't happen at the end of the court the way that you want it to happen, and it's okay because there are other people to judge them, your God. But I know it hurts every day. I tell people I cry every day. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm sorry. But I just want you to know that just keep fighting.
These kids gotta stop, and they need to start telling what they know.
Yes, it does.
Because it don't just affect, you think, okay, I pulled that trigger, okay, I done something. But also you killed yourself, you killed your family.
I wrote down all the names. 6 families. I mean, even if my baby wasn't killed, how do you like for your baby to be in jail, incarcerated? So many things that he could have done in life. But it's good to find out these things from you, Prosecutor Curry and Benita. Thank you, but I just wanted to know how it feels, and my heart aches for you because I know how it feels. That's all.
To your point, unfortunately, Ryan does, I do, so many of us in our office meet constantly with families of homicide victims. And one thing I say every single time is I appreciate that I cannot begin to comprehend the anger and grief that you must feel having experienced that. We're going to do a couple more things. First of all, if I don't do this, Annie Kern will yell at me. How do I know which is which, Annie? Oh, got it. Okay. For being here tonight, Benita, you have an Annie Kern gift package. And likewise for Detective Schemenauer. And again, I know others of you had questions, and so hold your questions, and Brian and Benita will be around to answering the individual questions. Just a reminder, next week, Monday is Columbus Day, and so next week's session will be on Wednesday, a week from Wednesday. And I won't give away too much, but it ultimately required 4 trials to convict the 6 defendants, and next week, Deputy Prosecutor will explain how the process worked from the moment that the case was filed by Detective Schemenauer and take you through that trial. So thanks for coming out tonight. Be safe, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.